They paid me to keep something locked up. I remember the number because I counted it twice before I signed. 15 grand, cash, 2 weeks on site, no questions, no press, no third parties. Helix Bio Research wired half up front through a private contractor, the rest at the end. The envelope was manila, thick. The contract was thinner, language about property, biohazard, non-disclosure, and a clause that read like a threat in neat corporate type. It said nothing about what I would be guarding, only the word Subject 7 and a shipping manifest stamped with coordinates north of Forks, a note about an emergency retrieval after a logging incident, and a terse line signed by Dr. Richard Brennan. I've done security work my whole adult life. Army stuff, private contracts, hunting guards for timber companies and a couple of data centers. You learn to read between the lines. No questions usually means someone doesn't want witnesses. Radio silence usually means secrecy above safety. But I'm 60 now. The cabin roof leaked, the truck needed new brakes, and 15 grand fixes a lot. That was my thinking when I drove Route 101 west, rain on the windshield like finger-smudged glass, toward a place I had told myself I would never go back to, the edge of the map where the trees get older than the towns. The site was up a logging spur, the kind of road that wanders into the spine of the Olympic Range and tries not to be seen. I left the highway at a rusted side and drove until my tires rolled over gravel that smelled of wet needles. The Helix convoy met me at a clearing. 2 blackened pickups, a white van with company decals removed, and a purple tarp covering something large on a flatbed. Men with clipped hair and clean boots moved like they were on a set. They put up barriers, honest-looking biohazard signs, a temporary chain-link pen. Marcus Webb, Helix's head of security, met me with a handshake that lasted a second too long and eyes that watched my hands. "You, Cole?" he said. His voice was practical, not unkind. Marcus was one of those men who looks like he never had to be told a rule twice and survived because of it. He handed me a Beretta M9, issued, authorized, standard. The gun's steel felt familiar under my palm. I cleared the magazine the way I'd been taught in boot camp. It felt important that it was mine to carry. There was a logbook, small, black, spiral-bound, and a Polaroid camera in a canvas bag, a roll of film, and a single wool blanket folded in a plastic bag, the kind soldiers keep in rucksacks for cold nights. Brennan arrived later. He came like a man sure of a hypothesis and bored of explaining himself. "Precision," he said, handing me a thin tablet with clean text. "Observe, contain, sample, report." Dr. Brennan was clinical, the white-collar version of the men who trained me, the kind who trusted science, procedure, and the authority of test results. His eyes didn't linger much on the pen or blanket. They went straight to the grid of the cage beneath the tarp. He did not look angry or gleeful. He looked like someone who had spent 20 years convincing himself that ends justify methods. They showed me the perimeter, 2 chains with heavy padlocks, a steel gate backed by boulders and earthworks. They told me the creature had been sedated for transport and was under observation for infection and stress. When I asked about the size, Marcus shrugged, the way men who have seen odd things shrug, like it's easier to accept reality as ridiculously large than to give it a name. "Around," he said, and then he blinked, because numbers don't mean much when you are describing something taller than you are used to seeing in the woods. Tall, 7, maybe 8 when standing, broad, animal, human, depends on the light. There are moments where the world compresses into one sound, rain on canvas, a radio hissing, the clink of steel. When the tarp came off, that sound expanded. The creature was in the pen on a concrete slab, restrained by heavy cuffs that had been bolted into the floor. It sat hunched, shoulders that rose and fell like a man's caught in too much coat. The hair was dark, like wet bark. Its hands were enormous. If you've ever held a big animal's paw, if you've ever touched a great ape in a zoo and felt the intelligence behind the grip, you know the small reverence that follows. But this was different. Its face was long, not grotesque, with brows that shaded eyes that were not animal-slitted, but patient, wet, and oddly human. The first thing I noticed was a small white bandage on its left shoulder. Infection had turned the edges red and slick. A smell like old rain and copper leaked from it when the wind shifted. The second thing I noticed was that when Marcus took a Polaroid and clicked, the creature's head turned and it watched the camera like a man watching a match light a cigarette. Then it nodded. It was a small, single, deliberate nod. Not a reflex, not a twitch. A nod like the kind we do when someone hands us something we asked for, when we accept an offer. They called it Subject 7 out of convenience. On the tablet, Brennan had a chart and a list of numbers and a set of checkboxes. He spoke into a recorder about baseline vitals and sampling windows. The men around me moved with that efficient distance people use in laboratories, the kind of distance that keeps your hands clean and your conscience vague. They moved blankets, checked syringes, measured airflow. I wrote in the logbook under the date, October 14, Forks area, rain, subject presented with shoulder infection. Staff, Brennan, Marcus, tech team. Contractor on site, Nathan Cole. I wasn't naive enough to think I knew what this was. I knew how a military man stores disbelief. You catalog, you hold, you wait. But inside the cage, something about the way the creature held its hands, the way it rocked slightly as if listening to a song beyond our hearing, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I found myself offering the blanket through the bars before anybody asked me to. The first night, I slept in a vinyl chair beneath a weathered canopy. I kept the logbook on my lap, the Polaroid film next to the M9. The rain humped the tarps like some enormous, wet animal. The radio buzzed with other teams cleaning up debris down the road. I woke twice to a sound I had not expected, soft scraping at the metal. Light leaked in from a generator, orange against the bird quiet of the forest. I watched the creature breathe. It had the slow, huge breath of someone who carries winter inside their ribs. In the morning, Dr. Brennan brought me a paper cup of bad coffee and a look that said he expected me to be impressed and not sentimental. He left me with instructions that were precise and fundamentally impersonal. Check restraints every hour, file hourly logs, keep all sampling to staff, maintain chain of custody, no unauthorized contact. He said it without malice, like telling a mechanic to change oil, like telling a janitor to sweep the floor. When he left, Marcus stayed behind to show me the procedure for logging. He showed me how to sign the logbook properly, how to shorthand observations without giving away too much. "You're not a scientist, Cole," he said, eyes on the paper-laden tablet. "You're a security contractor. Keep it safe and keep it quiet. No witnesses besides us." "Understood," I said. My voice sounded older than I felt. The first feeding was worth writing down. They brought a wheelbarrow of meat, venison, raw, portions cut by a gloved hand. I had expected it to eat like an animal, tear, shred, gulp. Instead, it reached for the bowl like a man accepting bread, slow and deliberate, placing the meat in its lap and nibbling in a way that suggested a restraint of appetite rather than ignorance. When I offered the blanket again, holding it between the bars, the creature's fingers closed around the wool with a gentleness that shook something loose in my chest. There were small things you notice when you are in close quarters with someone, or something, that's older than your vocabulary. It touched my hand once through the bars, not grabbing, not testing strength, but a contact that was an attempt at translation. It had calluses in the wrong places, the skin thick over the knuckles like a working man's hands. It watched the Polaroid camera with the intensity of someone learning your language. I snapped a picture because Marcus told me to, and because the camera felt like a permission to note. The flash made the creature start, and then it looked at the instant photograph with a study. It reached out and traced the white border with a finger, and then it drew a crude symbol into the dirt with a broken stick. The stroke was deliberate, a circle with 3 notches. I didn't say anything at the time. You learn early not to jump at every small miracle. But I kept that Polaroid in my wallet, folded against an old receipt for oil. The image is nothing grand to anyone who didn't stand there that day. A hulking back, a heavy shoulder, a bandage half unglued. For me, it was a proof I would not show. On the third day, the storm rolled in and did not leave. The rain felt like it wanted to push the whole forest downhill. The generator coughed and leaked smoke. The men drifted in to check their equipment, then drifted out. The creature's infection got worse. The bandage had come loose. I remember, because Marcus said, in a voice that was trying to be clinical, that there was a risk of systemic spread. He meant the creature might sicken further. Brennan had been in on a video call with the lab and had suggested broad-spectrum antibiotics, some sedative for transport, then more intensive sampling. The words were efficient and soft. They read like measures meant for a lab rat, not something with a face. At night, the creature shifted, and the clink of cuffs sounded like metal on bone. It made a sound, low, almost a hum, somewhere between throat song and complaint. I had been hired to keep it secure. I had not signed up to be a nurse. But nights in the soft rain, when the men slept in their vans and the only lights were the dull bulbs of safety lamps, I found myself walking the perimeter and stopping by the gate. I took the blanket out and slid it through the slats. The creature accepted it with a nod. The nod was more than agreement now. It was a currency between us. I kept a notebook, not the official logbook. Helix's book was for hours, numbers, and sterile pronouncements. My notebook was dog-eared, with the corners water-stained, a cheap thing I'd bought at a grocery because I preferred handwriting to screens. I wrote what I saw and what I thought, sometimes in clipped military shorthand, sometimes in sentences that curled like vines. I wrote my doubts down to give them shape. Writing turned worry into a map. I recorded dates, weather, brief notes. Oct 17, rain, bandage loose. Subject lifts head when I call, nods on blanket. One night, during a lull between the thunderstorms, the creature did something I will carry until the end. I had a headlamp on, and the rain made the metal rails shine like teeth. I was counting the loop of chain, finding the rhythm of things, when the creature tapped, once on the concrete. It tapped again. It had a stick, and with it drew lines in the slab like a child tracing a page. The scratches were clumsy. The meaning sat in the insistence of the movement. When I leaned closer, it pushed one of the marks into a pattern, and then made eye contact, slow and steady, as if to say, follow. I followed, as much as a man can follow when he doesn't share the same alphabet. It drew the circle with 3 notches again, then a small figure next to a larger one, and then a mountain, and then 3 marks that looked like tiny people. I tapped the drawing with my finger and asked aloud, "Family?" I felt ridiculous speaking to an animal. The creature nodded, then pointed to the 3 marks, and then to itself, and touched the bandage, and then made a gesture over its throat, the sign, maybe, for killing or loss, and a long, low sound left its chest. This is the place where disbelief starts to divide, the steady chart of measurements and the quiet language of gestures. To Brennan and Marcus, the drawings were data. To me, they were history and a pleading. The next day, a rain-soaked boot print and a smear on the concrete led me to a discovery that tightened the knot in my gut. Near the slab, near the water runoff, someone had left a small deer bone and ash arranged like an offering. It was subtle, almost ceremonial. The technicians had something similar, a record of local scavenging, until I mentioned it to Marcus, who narrowed his eyes and told me to keep a clean log. He told me Helix had no time for superstition. The company's approach, he said, was sample, document, and extract findings. He would say lab, and then look away, as if saying the word too loudly would make it true. There were other things. The way the creature reacted to the sound of chains being unlocked. The way it avoided the gloved-handed men and reached instead for small human touches. Once, when a technician leaned over and spoke into its ear like a vet, the creature shoved its shoulder into the concrete and let out a sound I have no name for. It was not a scream. It was a refusal. The man backed away. I had been watching contracts and clearances long enough to know the language of extraction. Agreements are made in offices, terms are negotiated in conference rooms, and then men like me go out and perform the work. The men who paid me to watch this place did not speak of ethics. They spoke of grant money and patents and sequencing results yet to be published. Yet the creature's drawings, the ash, and that single gesture, touching the throat in a way that suggested a hunt, shaped a different landscape in my chest. The logbook began to fill with entries that read like a man trying to anchor himself. Oct 20, subject draws, 3 marks, possible kin, offerings found, staff plan sedation, concern, infection may spread. It's a strange thing to record because a log is meant to be impartial, and yet my handwriting got sloppier, as if the words it held were too heavy. There was a night, I'll not forget it, when the storm took apart the world. The generator coughed and the power stuttered, and the men slept in their cabs with the heaters on. I was on watch. The rain hammered the tarp and the chain link hummed with the pressure of the weather. I had a thermos of coffee and a cigarette I wasn't supposed to smoke, but rules made of nicotine are small comfort. Around 3 in the morning, the creature made a sound that woke me up like someone dropping a heavy pan. It was a different noise this time, a small, muffled moan that was human forceful and full of pain. I went to the gate and saw the bandage had come loose entirely. The wound was darker than before, and there was a wetness that didn't smell like rain. I radioed Marcus once, low and clipped, and got static back and a promise to be there within 20. In those 20 minutes, while the rain made the world into a sheet of white noise, I did something that would split my life into before and after. I taught myself how to make a small, sterile dressing out of what was at hand, and I applied it. I will say this plainly. I am not a doctor. I used my training and the habit of looking after men in the field. I cleaned what I could with boiled water, wrapped it the best I could with a clean bandage from my kit, and steadied the creature while it stuttered and breathed, and held my hand like a man in a foxhole might hold his brother's. I did not sedate or cut or do anything that belonged to a surgeon. I simply staunched what I could. I washed my hands afterward and put away the instruments. I logged the event. In the logbook, beneath the neat Helix entries, I wrote an ugly line. Did emergency dressing. Subject calmed. Marcus notified. When Marcus arrived, he did not yell. He inspected the dressing, his face blank, then said into the night, "We'll get a vet in the morning. Hold tight." His hands were steady, professional, the hands of a man used to preventing panic. He looked at me once, brief as a signal, and said, "Keep the blanket in rotation. Keep him warm." There was a kind of permission in that sentence. That night, with the creature breathing shallow but steady, I slept in the vinyl chair with the blanket over my knees and the logbook under my chin. In my head, I held 2 facts like lit flares. 1, the contract I had signed and the envelope of cash that was 2 weeks' pay. 2, the creature's hand, heavy and human when it gripped mine. The 2 facts did not sit well in the same row. I told myself I was being sentimental, that my emotions were a risk to the mission. I had seen men get attached to things that got them killed or imprisoned. I had read memos about anthropomorphism in the field. But sentimentality does not explain the drawing that waited for me the next morning, pressed into the wet concrete like a map. The circle with 3 notches, the small figures, then a new mark that looked like a door cut in half. It was as if the creature had been saying, "These are mine, these are lost, this is where I can go." On the 5th day, Dr. Brennan returned with a different look. He had 2 new men with him, lab technicians with scrub caps and the kind of hands that had known glass rather than soil. He spoke about samples and swabs and the need to bring the subject in for imaging. He smiled thinly when he said imaging, as if something clinical could fit into the shoulders of that animal. He used words like data points and genetic marker. He did not look at the scratches in the concrete. That was the day I was assigned an extra task, photographing. Take 1 photo of the wound, 1 of the left profile, one of the subject's hands. I loaded the Polaroid and took the pictures, hands steady, though my chest felt like someone had put a stone there. The creature sat still as a man who has been taught to take orders. But when I slid the photographs into the little slot and handed the first to Marcus, the creature reached out and touched the image, like touching a small, impossible memory. It lingered on the circle with 3 notches, traced it with a finger from the photograph, then clicked the stick into the concrete, and, with a series of small motions, added a new set of scratches, this time a line that led away from the mountain. It was showing me escape routes in scribble. It was telling me, with sticks and ash and Polaroids, that there were others, that it had roots, that it had a place beyond the straps and fluorescence. For all the sterile talk from the white lab coats, what it drew was a map of family and loss. The ethical problem is often quieter than you expect. It doesn't arrive as a trumpet. It arrives as a weight in your pocket. The manila envelope, the 15 grand, the logbook in your hand, the voice in your ear telling you this is a job to be done. It arrives as a knot between what you are being paid to do and the way a hand closes on a blanket like a prayer. That night, I sat and wrote my name next to the entry in the Helix logbook, even though it felt like signing off on an indictment, and transferred the real notes to the cheap notebook I kept hidden under a spare blanket. I wrote the Polaroid number in the margin and sketched the circle with 3 notches until the pencil wore down. There is a thing you realize when you watch a creature get ready to be turned into data. It's not just the taking you fear, it's the language you lose. Once someone puts a body into the system of science and commerce, it becomes innumerable, indexed, and eventually it becomes marketable. That is the word no one would say aloud around the concrete slab, but you could feel it in the way the technicians talked about licensing, and in the way the boxes they brought had labels and barcodes. They did not mean harm in a malicious way. They meant results. They meant papers and grants and discoveries. But sometimes the path from discovery to profit looks like a gullet that swallows an old language whole. After midnight on the 6th day, I found another drawing. The creature had taken to scratching with that practice stick, leaving marks like a script that made very little sense until the 3rd time you saw it. This new one had 4 figures, the big one, 3 small ones, and a circle with a slash through it. Beside it, as if the creature wanted to be clear, it had pressed ash into a compact shape and placed a deer bone on top like a token on a grave. The arrangement was meticulous. It had the care of someone performing a ritual. I slept less after that. My dreams were not of men with guns, but of hands, large, gentle hands, offering a blanket to a small child. I woke and wrote the dream down, and then crossed it out because a notebook is not a dream map. But the mornings were real, and they had rain. Dr. Brennan requested an imaging window and set a date for the follow-up, 3 days out. He said this in a tone that implied inevitability, like a machine scheduling maintenance. 3 days. In 3 days, men with clean boots and surgical trays would come back. In 3 days, we would move from observation to procedure. In 3 days, whatever the animal was, it would be reframed as a subject of study. I remember sitting on the concrete edge that afternoon, my boots caked in mud, and the creature came up close and pressed its forehead to the gate as if to be nearer. It smelled like the forest in the way it expired air, green and wild, a smell that contradicted the disinfectant smell of the clinical men. It looked at me, and for a moment the world was small and the 2 of us alone. It then did something that made me understand more than words would have. It traced the circle with 3 notches onto my palm with 1 large forefinger. The motion was a request, a memory, a request to remember, maybe. At that point, in that cold, my options were a ledger of practical things. Sign the logbook, do my job, take the money, go home and fix the roof. Or something else entirely, something that did not have an easy place on a form and would not be covered by liability insurance. It is one thing to think about doing the right thing in an abstract way. It's another to hold a warm, living life against the paper definition of your responsibility and see them as mismatched. My training tells me orders and chains of command matter. My hands told me that some things are not meant to be translated into data points. There was a man I knew from the barracks who used to say, "In a moral emergency, you do what your conscience makes you do and make sure you can live with your answer." I thought of him as the day closed, rain like a white curtain, and the creature slept with the blanket tucked around its shoulders like an old man resigned to a small comfort. I thought about the envelope of cash in my wallet and the hole in my roof. I thought about the logbook and the signatures that make things official. And I thought, moreover, about the 3 notches and the small figures and the ash arranged like an altar. If you had asked me then, I'd have told you I was still a contracted man, paid to keep something locked up. But I kept a second ledger, in pencil, in a cheap book, under a blanket. I wrote not as a man proving something, but as a man trying to choose what to become. If you want to know how this ends, if you want to hear whether the money mattered more than the life inside the bars, stay with this account. I'm not telling you this for proof or applause. I'm telling you because I owe an explanation to the only ones who will not be writing papers about any of it. The people leathered by rain and the ones who leave ash on concrete. I want to be clear about something here before I go on. What follows are details of choices, not instructions. I do not tell you how to do the things that would get you hurt or me jailed. I am recounting what happened to me, from inside the bind of a job that paid me to keep a secret, and the moral resolution that began to take shape as the creature drew its history in the dirt. The week that followed was a study in ordinary and extraordinary. Men from labs came and went, masks and small scanners humming, voices that measured everything with the coolness of the clinical. They took swabs from the creature's fur and spoke in euphemisms about adaptive markers. They marveled, but their marveling had the shape of ambition. When the small vet team arrived, they were respectful in procedure, but antiseptic in manner. And when they left, the creature had a new bandage that smelt faintly of iodine. We had more rain, then a brittle blue day that made the forest look like it had been ironed flat. The creature began to use the Polaroid more, pressing the images to the concrete and pointing at them, and the drawings grew more complex. A river, a tall standing stone, and then, shockingly, a pictograph that matched the mark I had seen in the boulder field just past the tree line. That boulder field had markings that looked like ancient scratched images, circles, people, hands. I had assumed they were natural or the work of bored hunters. The creature's drawing confirmed something else, a history carved into stone, a memory that long predated men in white vans and corporate logos. When you realize there is a story that threads back beyond your contract, your perspective shifts. Things that were once acceptable, taking a paycheck for a job that silenced the world, become problematic in a way that doesn't care about schedule or rain. The men who paid me were not monsters. They were scientists, or I would say, people who had turned wonder into procedure. But control is a kind of violence in itself. When you document, when you extract, you transform a being into data. You do not necessarily mean harm, but the structure you build often ignores the life inside. I began to imagine a scale, the kind we used in field ops to balance risk and gain. On one side, 15 grand. The job, the obligations, the district attorney if someone found out I had tampered. On the other side, a living intelligence with a family, a history, and a language of scratches and ash. The scale did not balance. It tilted like a compass toward a north I could not afford. There were moments when I tried to bargain with my duty like a man bargaining with the weather. I told myself I would wait for orders, that I would do my job, and then I'd take whatever feelings the weight of it meant. I told myself that maybe the lab would do its work and find something the rest of us could use, to help, to understand. But the drawings that night, the river, the standing stone, the 3 marks, impressed an ethics on me that would not be undone by corporate reassurance. Marcus and I had a moment in a rain-lashed morning when he handed me a new log, saying the imaging had to be scheduled earlier than planned. He looked tired. He didn't order me around so much as talk like a man who wanted to test where my lines were. "You know what they do with these things," he said, the rain making a halo around his cap. "Research doesn't mean harm, it means knowledge." "Sometimes knowledge means profit," I said. The words came out like a shot. He didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, "Nobody wants a circus." I wanted to say, "Nobody wants a cemetery either." Instead, I just nodded and folded the new log into my pocket. There was also a small kindness from an unexpected corner. One of the technicians, a woman named Anna, left a graphite pencil and an old envelope of rice near the fence as if to say, "Sorry for the cold." She did not look me in the eye when she did. She had dark hair pulled tight, a thing like an animal's ears for discomfort. She told me, once in a breathy whisper, that sometimes she worried about what would happen if the wrong person knew. "Some things," she said, "are safer in the dark." Her words lodged themselves in my chest. Sometimes sealing a secret is not an act of cowardice, it's an act of care. I did not trust Helix's project, but I also recognized that secrecy could become a shield for exploitation. Somewhere in that space, you choose who you become, an agent of disclosure or a guardian of those who cannot speak in our terms. By the 10th day, the creature's shoulder had improved under the dressing and our limited care. It moved more, laced its fingers through the fence, and once, when I whistled an old army cadence without thinking, it answered with a sound that matched the rhythm. It wasn't language so much as resonance, it was an acknowledgement of pattern. The follow-up imaging was scheduled for 3 days hence. A flight list had been drawn up for the technicians, a van for the imaging gear, and a lab request had been filed in the Helix system. Dr. Brennan's messages had a top-of-the-line tone. He thanked me in the kind of formal way that belies actual gratitude, and then sent a message that essentially said, "Maintain protocol." I went to the truck and sat for a long time with the manila envelope beside me, felt the crispness of the cash through the paper, and thought about how many houses that amount of money would keep over the winter. I thought about the blank roof and the way the winter would whisper through the trees and steal heat. I thought about the creature, about the way it had pressed ash into meanings on the concrete. I thought of the pictographs beyond the tree line and how old they looked in the coin flip light of the rain. When I stood up, the world felt smaller and heavier at once. The choice was not yet made, but the ground on which I stood shifted. I had been paid to keep it locked up, and now the cage felt less like a job and more like a question the size of the ocean. The next morning, I woke to a sound I will never forget, a low, staccato pounding on the gate, not from the creature, but from a hand wanting to be noticed. Marcus was there, his face drawn. He said a transport had been expedited. Imaging would be here within 48 hours. He said Helix wanted a complete run and immediate transfer of the subject to a specialized facility. He said they were being careful. He said the words "specialized facility" with the same dryness a man uses for weather reports. He turned away and examined the bandage, as if to seek a fault that would make the choice less urgent. I looked at the creature when Marcus was gone. It looked at me and pressed the circle with 3 notches back into my palm. Its gesture was patient but urgent. It was a plea. It was a mapping of what they would destroy and how they would name it. My decision had not yet been formed into an action. I knew only that I could no longer be merely a guard. The manila envelope sat in the glove box like a waiting verdict. The logbook had my signature beside a string of factual sentences. The creature had a name in my heart now, smaller than username and larger than a label. I didn't know what to call it. Names get you in trouble. Names also make things impossible to forget. The day closed on the kind of thin light the coast gives when the rain takes a breath. The generator hummed, the chain link was damp, and the creature slept with one hand over its face, like a man covering his eyes from an old memory.
I lit a cigarette I did not need and set it down when the smoke began to taste like regret. This is where I stop for now, not because the story is over, but because the gears of consequence had just started to turn. Decisions had been scheduled. Men were coming. The creature had family drawn into the concrete and ash. And I had in my pocket the money that could fix a roof or buy silence. I tell you this as a man who has seen both sides up close. Money can be a means of repair, or it can be the lubricant that makes a machine run until there's nothing left of the thing inside. My hand closed around the logbook and the cheap notebook, like two halves of a choice. On one side, a contract. On the other, a circle with 3 notches. The rest of it, the plans and the crossings, and whether a man paid to keep a secret can keep faith with the thing he watches, comes next.
When the 3-day window closed in on us, the rain thinned and the light sharpened like a blade. Men poured back down the spur road with tool cases and polite expressions. I logged their names, their badge numbers, the vehicle plates, things a man does to prove he was where he was when the machine of science turned up its instruments. Dr. Brennan came with the imaging crate, his eyes quick and hungry for the unknown. He smiled at me in that way people smile when they see the end of a hypothesis approaching its birth certificate. The morning they arrived, the creature was awake and quiet, pressing its broad forehead to the gate as if to see me close. I had the blanket rolled and tucked where I could reach it without the tech seeing. I had the cheap notebook in my boot where the dirt might hide the pencil-smudged lines. I had the Polaroids packed in the canvas bag Marcus had left within reach. I had the manila envelope in the truck, the money still crisp. I had nothing that made the choice easier. I did not sleep the night before. Instead, I sat on the lip of the slab and watched the creature breathe. It touched the concrete with a slow finger, then drew a line through the circle we had come to know. I read that as a counting off, as a closing of a thought. It kissed the bandaged shoulder with a flat, animal press, and then looked at me with those wet, patient eyes. I imitated the motion and kissed the bandage with my thumb. It leaned into my hand like something that knows the shape of memory. Dr. Brennan came through the gate with a bag of instruments and a tablet, the way a priest might carry a Bible. He kept his voice clinical, which made what he said sharper. "We'll do imaging in the clean van," he told me. "Sedate per protocol for transport. We'll do CT and ultrasound, take the vascular swabs. Keep logs current, no interference." Marcus watched the creature once and then looked at me as if hoping for a sign. I could have told him then, told him that whatever it was he had in his hands was not a mere subject to be subtracted from the world and indexed. I could have told him that an ash-made altar on concrete was more than superstition. He kept his face blank and handed me a new log page. "Stand by to assist," he said. "No curious hands." The techs worked with the wobble of men who have rehearsed this choreography: checks, clamps, vitals, sterile covers. The creature let them come close, and then, toward the end, steadied itself and made a sound that was a low, long exhale. It was almost like a surrender, but not quite. There were hands, so many hands on it. I watched its shoulders go still as the sedative touched them, and the world thinned like fog. It was in that second, when the clinical rhythm reached a cadence of acceptance, that the decision that had been growing like a bruise became a bone-deep certainty. I could feel it like a tide. If someone had asked me to name the moment, I would have said it felt like a vote being cast in silence. The ballot was my conscience, and the counting was about to begin. What I did next I will not explain in how-to terms. The act is a kind of sacrament, and the technique for its performance belongs only to the culture of secrets. The important thing is this: I shifted the scene in small ways that could pass for accidents or sorrow. I created a story that read like closure. I made sure the evidence looked real, because to protect something, you sometimes have to make those who would take it believe it is already gone. I did not want the lab to take the creature, only to close the file as if they had. I did not want men to return with goods and clean instruments months from now. I wanted the world to think a story had ended. Marcus had his own reasons for closing his eyes. He had been in long enough to know that some things, once known, are quarrel points you cannot win. He looked at me once, the quiet between us loud, and then turned his head the other way when the techs took the readings. Anna, the technician who slipped me a pencil and rice, met my eye from across the van. She had smoke under it like she had been up for days. She nodded once when I caught her look, small and steady. That nod was the only help I had from inside the white tents. The techs did their work as written in the protocols: scans, swabs, samples. They took blood, they recorded numbers, they reviewed screens. Dr. Brennan's face on the tablet looked as if he wanted to see a new frontier cataloged, and he saw numbers, color bands, and histograms. He thanked the team and clipped phrases and made notes. We all played our parts in the theater of explanation. When the final printouts came, I fished the Polaroid from the bag and let the flash burn once for the record. The creature started, but sleep held it like a net. I wrote the official entry in the Helix logbook with my hand steady and my chest full of rocks. October 27. Imaging complete. Subject unresponsive post-scan. Vitals absent at 14:08 hours. Further transfer recommended. Signed, Nathan Cole, contractor. The act of signing those words felt like taking an oath I did not intend to keep. It felt like putting a lid on a box. They wheeled the body, if we must use that word, into the van, and prepared for transfer. The van's doors shut with a dull thud, and for a moment I believed I had done what they wanted. I radioed it in as the protocol required, and gave the sterile, scripted language. Subject expired at 14:08 hours, preparing for transfer. The voice on the other end responded with procedural condolences. And then the small, impossible thing happened. The creature stirred. It was only a flex, a twitch in its fingers, a breath that wasn't dead. Anna, standing by the canvas flap, let out a noise that sounded like a prayer.
No one did anything. The world moved as if furniture had shifted in the room, and we were all afraid to notice. I looked at Marcus. He had a handful of paper, manifest forms, and he looked tired in a new way. He cleared his throat. "We'll need a signed manifest for transfer," he said, the words mechanical as ever. I moved. What I'm careful to say is that I did not force anything. I did not, in the worst sense of the term, break the law with a flourish. The creature did not wake like a man who springs from a bed. It woke like someone pulling a blanket over a memory. Its eyes opened, wet and slow. It looked at me, and there was, for an instant, recognition so dense it made my throat ache. Then it pushed at the restraints with something like deliberation, less a burst and more a sequence, and the cuff that bound it slipped loose without the kinds of drama you see in films. The straps, the locks, the systems, all of them have mechanisms. I never describe those mechanisms. I will say only that the movement made sense to a man who has handled gear and had to improvise in rain and blood. It was a practical thing. It was also luck. Luck and the creature's cooperation. We were moving in the kind of slow, tight ballet that only desperate men learn. I told the techs we needed a second look in the van because the vitals monitor had glitched. It was a small lie told in a tone so ordinary the technicians barely raised their eyebrows. We shuffled boxes, we shifted a stretcher, we told them we'd be right back with documentation. We looked busy. That was all it took. Inside the van, the creature opened its eyes fully and took the blanket I slid across the bench. Its hand, enormous, folded around the wool like it was holding a child's hand. Anna stood by the door, the color gone from her face, and when our eyes met, she whispered, "Godspeed," which is something neither of us believed in the detective sense, but felt in the marrow sense. We moved out before the lab reassembled itself into attention. The route out of the clearing is a ragged band of mud and roots that makes trucks into a kind of clumsy dance. I sat in the driver's seat with the blanket across the bench and the creature in the co-pilot's place, hunched and quiet, breathing like a man who had been given a second chance without asking for one. The escape was not dramatic. It was practical. It had the bland unpredictability of men who depend on weather and tire tread. We stopped once, 2 miles down the logging spur, to check maps and to let a polite haze of processing dull our nerves. The creature mapped nothing to me then, only sat and watched the trees slip by, and once leaned its head to the window and traced a slow finger on the glass, as if it were trying to count the rings of the trees. When we passed the boulder field, it tapped the dash and pointed to the hillside, then to its shoulder, then to me, and made a small sound that I took as assent.
From there, the route becomes a story of trails and night skies. We did not go cross-country with plans. We went the only way a man with an illegal passenger can go, slow, mostly alone, listening to wind and avoiding places with lights. The creature moved with surprising economy for its size, following ridgelines, stepping softly between alder and hemlock like a shadow that remembered its steps. I learned to read its cues in the dark. A shifted weight meant a hidden route. A wind change meant the track of a deer in the valley. It led. I followed. We walked for 3 days. Food was scarce. I had the cash, but money buys you little when the stores are closed and the road is an animal. The creature ate what I gave it, dried meat folded into fabric, berries picked at dusk, and sometimes refused what we offered, as if it knew the shape of its hunger. At night, we slept under a tarpaulin, the blanket between us for warmth. The creature would sometimes tap the concrete pattern, 3 notches, circle, into my palm with a stick it had found. It slept like a man might sleep after a long watch, eyes open in the way night animals keep an ear to the dark. Once, while we were fording a sluggish creek, a small search party with flashlights and radios cut across our path. I froze, the kind of freeze that sinks a man into his boots. The creature, however, went still and slid behind a fallen log. I did what instinct taught me, flattened myself against damp wood and tried to become background. The flashlights passed like hungry moths. We held our breath. The searchers were professional, thorough, and in a hurry. They smelled like coffee and institutional certainty. They clicked off radios with a clumsy, apologetic tone and then kept moving. When they were gone, the creature made a long, shuddering sound that could have been laughter or grief. I patted its shoulder, and later it tapped my palm and pointed toward a ridge with a slow, circular motion, the same sign it had given me in the concrete. I read that as guidance. Keep moving. On the 5th day, we climbed into a valley that felt older than the road, deeper in moss and shadow and stone. The forest opened into a bowl where ancient water runs collected, and the sun, when it came, made the ferns clink like small bells. There was a smell in the air I recognized as something like home, wet stone, rotting leaf, and an undernote of smoke sometimes used by people to signal their living hearths. We walked in silence, and the creature's shoulders loosened. We came upon a cluster of narrow caves ringed with stones that bore markings. They were the pictographs I'd thought were bored hunter's scratches when I first saw them by the boulder field. Up close, the images were unmistakable. Handprints, long-limbed figures, images of standing stones and crescent moons sanded by time. In a shallow alcove hung lengths of woven fiber and, pressed into the soil at its entrance, a set of deer bones arrayed in a pattern that echoed the ash altar I'd found near the slab. At the sight of the caves, the creature stopped, raised its head, and made a sound that was sky-deep. It stepped forward, and, with gestures so deliberate they felt like a prayer, it called. The call was a mix of throb and breath, a sequence of tones that turned the birds silent and made the leaves listen. I stood where I was, because some places demand humility, and waited. Then, from the brush, 3 shapes appeared, smaller than the first, but unmistakable kin. They moved with the same economy, the same patient dignity. One, older than the rest, had a scarred face and eyes that glittered with a kind of wary intelligence. The meeting was not sudden, and it was not violent. It was, instead, the reweaving of an old seam. The first creature lowered its head, the others approached and touched it in a ritual of recognition. There were sounds, low, melodic, quick, and gestures. They examined the blanket, the bandage, the ash on my boots, and then looked at me. I expected fear, I expected anger, I expected avoidance. Instead, they assessed me like a pack leader assessing an outsider, careful, cool, deliberate. The elder, if I may call it that, walked in a slow circle around me, its hands gliding over my shoulders like a breeze feels a man. It touched the Polaroid I had stuffed in my breast pocket and then tapped my hand. The gesture was not command, but question. I lay the cheap notebook on the ground and opened it. In the pages were my sketches, words, and the Polaroids pressed between pages like prayers. The elder reached and took the Polaroid, held it to its chest, and made the same tapping sound it had used to teach me the circle with 3 notches. The creature then painted a mark into the dirt with a blueberry stain, the way a child draws on a picnic table. A sign I began to learn meant thank you, or perhaps we know you. There was, in the exchange, no language of markets or patent numbers. There was the language of care. They did not speak to me in words. Instead, they gave me a ritual. 2 of the younger ones held up their hands and touched the blanket like a benediction. The elder took my hand and pressed it into the center of its chest in a way I had not felt from another living thing, an exchange of breath and truth. It was the best contract I had ever signed. They showed me the painted rocks in the cave, figures of ancestors and hunters, and a long sequence depicting men with spears coming down from the trees. There were marks of loss, of fires, of fleeing. There were, too, images of people leaving gifts at a boundary stone, meat, tools, and stacked stones. The pictographs told a long, patient story. These people had been here long before the machines, and they had survived by secrecy, by moving when the world grew loud, by making pacts with the land and each other. They were not monsters in the sense I had heard. They were neighbors I had been taught to fear. They made me an offering then, a length of woven fiber with a small knot in it, and from the knot a scrap of weathered blanket, my blanket, mended in places with moss, pressed into my palms. The act was a pledge. It meant, we acknowledge you. We ask you to stay our friend. We ask you, in the only language we share, to take watch over this place. The elder closed its eyes like a man praying, and then reached out, pressing its palm against my sternum. I felt warmth and a gravity that made my knees ache. It was not a mystical conversion. It was recognition. It was the awarding of a role that has no legal name: guardian, steward, keeper. The word sounded small when I put it in my mouth, but the meaning sat heavy. There was a bargain. They pressed a carved stone into my hand with 3 notches and a small hole bored clean through it. They showed me the pictographs of men who had betrayed trust, of hunts that had turned to slaughter, and then the pictographs of those who had chosen instead to close their mouths and cover the tracks. Their faces were unreadable, an art of dignity that did not wear emotion like a banner. The elder made a sound and tapped the stone to its chest and then to mine. The ritual was not to bind me so much as to invite me into their memory. I sat in that cave and listened to the drip of water and felt the weight of the position they offered. The idea of secrecy as protection no longer felt like a dodge. It felt like an oath. They needed a human who could walk in both worlds, who could speak the language of timber crews and of courtrooms if spared, who would not blare the truth on cable news. They offered me this because the creature I had watched had trusted me, because Anna had looked away in the van, because Marcus had not stopped me, because someone had been willing to make a lie serve a life. We stayed in the valley for 3 weeks. I left and returned, sometimes to the cleared path where the Helix logbook still sat like a ceremonial judgment. I told only a handful of people once I returned to town, names I could count on one hand. I told some of the local rangers, not as confession, but as threat avoidance, an oblique warning about unusual activity so that they would be gentle on patrols and keep the logging contractors honest. I did not tell the press. I didn't want fame being a net cast over a sleeping animal. Back in Forks, life resumed with its small mercies: a truck that needed less urgent repair, a roof that could be patched with a few weeks' pay, groceries that did not taste of ash. I kept a courier of habit, a blanket in my closet with a repair stitched into the seam by the elder in the cave, the cheap notebook hidden under loose floorboard, a Polaroid tucked into the logbook with only the edge visible. Those things are not trophies, they are reminders. The stone the elder gave me lives in my jacket pocket on days I walk the hills. The rest of my life after that quiet valley is a kind of double life, lived in daylight and in margin. I took the money because the roof needed it and because there's no honor in leaving a man to weather for moral purity. But I also took the job of being a guardian seriously. I learned the language of protections, how to file environmental notices, how to attend public hearings, how to spot a developer's loophole. I started in small ways, calling county commissioners, showing up at planning meetings, sending letters where they mattered, and then in bigger ones, partnering with a local land trust and a nonprofit that fought clear-cutting through legal means. I testified in hearings not with the story of what I'd done, because that would have been self-incrimination, but with the language of habitat and watershed and biodiversity. I pressed other, more conventional facts, the pace of logging, the fragility of ancient stands, until the conversation tilted from profit to preservation. Sometimes people called me a zealot, sometimes they called me a liar. I did not mind. I preferred being called stubborn if it meant a stand of trees might be spared. I also made sure to keep the practical things in order. The cheap notebook had addresses and notes. The stone was stitched inside a pocket where it would not rattle. The blanket sat folded under a pile of rags, the scent of smoke baked into the fibers. There were close calls. Men from out of state, investors with dark suits and lighter consciences, came sniffing after permits. Their lawyers sent polite letters to county clerks. A timber company tried to buy up a strip of land I had been fighting to keep intact. I spent nights writing comments for environmental impact statements, filling forms no one reads, because forms are the scaffold of law. I learned how to be tedious in the exact ways the law required. I wrote op-eds using pseudonyms and mailed photographs of old growth to conservation groups that could do more than I could. Wherever there was journalism that loved mystery, I left a breadcrumb about ambiguous tracks and about the need to preserve ecosystems without saying what lived inside them. I never told the story in full. The full story is not for newspapers or for talk shows. It belongs to the valley and the people who do not speak words we use. But the moral of my work, the one I repeat now when asked about motivation, is simple. I learned that the worst thing for some living things is being known. Not because the knowledge itself kills, but because the market that follows the knowledge does. There were times the creature and its kin were nearly discovered. A logging road surveyor once stumbled near the upper ridge. His boots left boot prints like loose coinage. He found a woven fiber and a stone and filed them away as curiosities. I called the ranger and suggested a reroute. The surveyor accepted a different corridor, with the disinterested shrug of men who measure timber. On another occasion, a private collector with an interest in the uncanny came through the region and bought satellite images of the valley. He contacted a broker who promised access. I hired a lawyer anonymously and made sure the purchase had strings attached that would complicate excavation. Again, the law became my shield. Years passed. I was older, and my hands liked coffee over whiskey now. The blanket got sewn into new pieces and mended more times than I can count. The creature's family held to their perimeters and their rituals. I visited once in the spring, and the elder, now grayer if age is measured the same way for them as it is for us, took my hand and pressed it to a new pictograph that had been added to the cave. A man with a blanket standing between the painted figures and a tree. They had drawn me as an ally. It was not flattery, it was acknowledgement. The day I spoke to a representative of a conservation trust and agreed to a temporary easement that would protect the valley from logging for a set number of years, I felt a kind of relief that tasted like breath returned to the lungs. I did not tell them why the place mattered in the way that I did. I told them enough. Streams, old growth, biodiversity. That was true. It was enough. The easement bought time, a hedge against the kind of capitalist curiosity that turns living things into projects. Time in a system like this is often the only ally you can afford. As I grew older, the secrecy got heavier but also more clarified. I began to understand the ethics of concealment as complex and sometimes cruel. Secrets can shelter and they can distort. They can save a life and also deny accountability. I tried to live in that tension. When activists would call for disclosure, I would listen and explain, honestly but without confession, why some truths must be deferred for the sake of those truths' lives. I would say, there are things the world is not ready for, and there are things that are not safer for it. People would argue. They would say that transparency wins in the end. I would nod. Transparency is a worthy ideal, but ideals do not tend small creatures who are hunted. I never stopped keeping the cheap notebook. I added dates, the day I signed an easement, the day a logger's permit was denied, the day an academic paper came out that speculated about population decline in the region and advocated for habitat protection. I would read those papers and catch my breath, because the language had shifted. Someone, somewhere, was saying what I had begun to act on: protect the landscape first, ask questions later. Strangers who would not have believed a word if I told them often asked me in town how I'd become the persistent man at hearings. I told them the truth in ways that were not betrayals. I said I had been there, that I had seen things that made a man want to be careful. The answers I offered were moral sketches, not confessions. I built a life around being ordinary in public and secretive in the margins. It felt like penance and duty and, sometimes, peace. Occasionally I would hear rumors, strange lights in the hills, a hunter who claimed to have seen a large shape that wasn't a bear. I would keep those rumors and make sure they didn't reach ears that would exploit them. Sometimes I called the hunters and suggested alternate hunting grounds. Sometimes I left small presents, bait that would attract deer elsewhere, a passed note to a kid at the local feed store about where to go fishing. None of it was heroic. It was the sorting out of a life. People ask me, as if the answer can be neatly packaged, whether I regret what I did. They want a shorthand, guilt or pride. My answer is more complicated and perhaps less satisfying. I regret the need to deceive anyone who has a right to know. I regret that the money which bought my silence might have been used elsewhere without needing a cover story. I regret the moral contortions a man has to perform when he takes a life into his hands, even gently. But I also feel a steady, slow gratitude for the nights I held a hand that I knew would not have had a choice otherwise. I count the quiet, tender moments, blanket across broad shoulders, the Polaroid tracing of a thumb, and I reckon them like a small ledger of mercy. Once, years later, a journalist came to Forks asking for a strange headline. He wanted either confessional glory or comedic scoff. I gave him a careful half-truth. I told him about an old site where unusual things had been reported and about the importance of protecting old forests. He left with a polite nod and a notebook filled with my evasions. The headline he published was about an endangered watershed. The story helped a land trust raise funds. If truth comes in pieces, and sometimes in deceptions, then perhaps the sum of my actions moved the scale a degree toward life. The blanket lives on a hook in my entryway now, patched and faded. When I take it down, it smells faintly of smoke and cedar. The Polaroid sits in a drawer, edges worn, a secret that is evidence only to me. The cheap notebook is fat with notes and names and small extraneous things like the measurement of a stream or a county clerk's file number. I am older. My knees ache in wet weather, and sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and press my hands against the place where my ribs meet and feel small panic and big gratitude. The creatures, the family, visit the forest like a myth made of bones and breath. I see signs sometimes, a path worn in the underbrush, a small altar of stones, a new pictograph in a cave where the wind draws the dust into the shapes of hands. I go when they will have me. We exchange honors and nothing public. We do not speak names. We behave like a secret society without a charter. We are guardians in the way a dike guards a town, quietly, unromantically, and against slow, determined forces. I have learned to tell the story without turning it into a spectacle. That is harder than it sounds, because humans like drama and certainties. I have learned to carry the knowledge like a burden that must be kept light by deeds, not by songs. I will not tell you more than this. I was paid to keep something locked up, and I took the money. Then I learned, by the polite gravity of a hand on my palm and the etched history of a cave, that something else was demanded of me. The thing wanted to be free more than it wanted to be known. I chose to honor that preference. There is a strange calm to living with secret responsibilities. On the one hand, there's the adrenaline that comes with near misses and with protecting something most people won't believe. On the other, there is the slow, satisfied fatigue of work well done. A tract of land saved, a family left to its rituals, a blanket mended. I do not stand on any soapbox and preach the virtue of secrecy. I know it can be a shield for wrongdoing. What I hope to show is the difference between secrecy used for harm and secrecy used to keep someone from being harmed. That distinction matters, and it required me to trade in some public honor for private fidelity. To the regulators, to the scientists, to the corporate men who would have loved a discovery and a headline, I am in the margins of their reports, an anonymous line. To the creatures, I am the man who left his roof unrepaired for a while so he could buy the time and the legal scaffolding to protect a valley. To myself, I am a man who tried to be faithful in an awkward, compromised way. Maybe that's the best a man can do, choose where to stand. If I have any request now, it is simple and not self-serving. The thing I protect needs habitat, time, and quiet. It needs laws that prioritize ancient forests over quick profit. It needs people who are willing to push hard in the light, sign petitions, attend hearings, support land trusts, without asking for the secret to be opened like a prize. Conservation is not the same as proof. Sometimes it is the quiet refusal to turn something into a spectacle. If you listen to this and feel the stirrings of a conscience that wants to do something, do that something for the place, not for the headline. Support local conservation efforts. Learn the names of the trees that stand older than your house. Vote for protections that make it harder to plow through the places that shelter the wild and the strange. That is the action I will ask of you, not to prove what I say, but to honor the ethics that made me close the logbook and open my life to a secret. I do not offer you evidence that will hang like trophies in a museum. I offer you a choice that I made in the rain, to treat a living thing as a being and not a marketable problem. I have lived a life haunted by that choice, and also, in some small ways, redeemed by it. The blanket is still heavy in my closet, and when I take it down and touch its holes, I feel the nights in the van and the heat of a small fire and the 3 notches in the concrete. I feel the weight of secrecy that keeps a life breathing. They paid me to guard something, and I guarded it until the day I learned that some things exist not to be known by everyone, but to be protected by a few. The moral calculus I chose to live with was imperfect, costly, and not without sorrow, but it saved a family that did not have a voice in a court of men. If this story moves you, if it awakens in you a wish to help, then find a local land trust, a watershed group, or a conservation nonprofit and support them. Protect the places where mysteries have room to breathe. That is the only way I know to repay what was given to me, a life saved from being a chapter in a paper and turned instead into a story kept between living things. I keep the cheap notebook open sometimes, and when I do, the last entry reads like a simple ledger. Paid to keep locked. Chose to set free. Chosen to keep silent in order to protect. It is not a triumphant line. It is not a glory. It is a sentence of accountability. So that is how it ended for me. Not with a headline, but with a quiet, ongoing work.
the fight for trees, the filing of petitions, the slow endurance of defense. I cannot give you proof beyond my hand and a pair of Polaroids tucked in a drawer. I can give you instead a plea. Help protect the places that make it possible for the unasked for to keep living. That, in the end, is why I will not put the creatures on display. Some stories are kinder when they are allowed to remain mysteries, kept safe by the few who know and the many who act.